Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, a really captivating journey right into the heart of psychoanalysis. We're talking about an intellectual event that, profoundly shaped the 20th century, really unearthing the hidden depths of the mind, exploring concepts that for a long time felt almost mystical. Our mission today is custom tailored for you, our listener. We want to provide a bit of a shortcut to understanding the complex world of Sigmund Freud and his, well, equally influential successors. The goal isn't to overwhelm you with jargon, definitely not. It's more about extracting the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from our source material. We'll aim for a clear structure and engaging delivery that respects your time, really unpacking the origins of this revolutionary field, exploring its core concepts, and witnessing its surprising, often quite dramatic, evolution.
That's right. And our primary source for this deep dive is Dmitry Kostov's insightful work, Dangerous Method, 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. It offers a really rich historical, philosophical perspective, focusing on, the foundational figures of Freud and Lacan. What stands out immediately, I think, is how the material lets us appreciate the dynamic, the evolving nature of psychoanalytic thought. It wasn't static, not a monolithic theory at all. It's really a journey through ideas that were constantly being refined, challenged, even by their own creator.
Yeah.
The genesis of an idea, Sigmund Freud and his world.
Okay, let's unpack this journey then. We have to start with the man himself, Sigmund Freud. The sources really emphasize that to truly grasp psychoanalysis, we absolutely need to begin with his personal history. So what are some of the maybe striking or surprising details from his early life that really set the stage for these revolutionary ideas?
Well, we're talking about Sigismund Shlomo Freud, born May 6, 1856, in Freiburg, Moravia, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire then. His father, Jacob Kalaman Freud, was a hereditary Jewish merchant from eastern Galicia. And his mother, Amalia Nathanson, was, remarkably young for Jacob's wife. Sigmund was the eldest of 9 children. And by 1860, the family had moved to Leopoldstadt, which was a pretty poor suburb of Vienna. Now, what's fascinating here is the significance of his early life. Sigmund wasn't just the firstborn factually, but legally too, and he was clearly the favored child, especially by his mother, who affectionately called him Golden Ziggy. This upbringing, it fostered in him this profound sense of being a leader, maybe even a chosen one. His siblings, the sources say they reportedly worshipped him, but also saw him as something of a tyrant.
A tyrant? How so?
Well, for instance, he apparently controlled what they read. He couldn't stand the sound of a piano because it interfered with his studies. And he found it perfectly normal for his sisters to gather in a communal room with just one candle, while he sat alone with his oil lamp, studying. Quite the setup.
So his path was set very early then. A deliberate family decision for him to pursue knowledge, not trade. That unique trajectory, combined with this chosen one status, maybe that instilled the relentless drive, the singular focus that became hallmarks of his work. It might have even influenced his later theories on ambition, right?
It certainly seems plausible. It's quite a formative upbringing. And he definitely had the intellect to match that ambition.
He did.
Absolutely. Freud possessed an exceptional intellect, a remarkable capacity for learning. He was consistently the top student in his class, navigated the contemporary scientific and cultural landscapes with, apparent ease. And his language skills were extraordinary. He mastered numerous languages: English, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, plus ancient Greek, Latin, ancient Hebrew, and Yiddish.
Wow. That linguistic prowess really speaks volumes about his dedication, his ability to engage with just so many different texts and ideas.
It really does.
And what's particularly striking, especially given the context of Vienna at the time, is that despite the prevalence of Viennese anti-Semitism, his Jewish heritage wasn't actually a significant barrier to his medical career. That feels surprising, doesn't it? It speaks to a unique intellectual environment, perhaps.
It does seem surprising from our perspective. The sources note that there were a large number of Jewish doctors in Vienna at the time, which perhaps mitigated direct professional barriers for him in medicine specifically, even amidst wider societal anti-Semitism.
Okay, so with Freud set on this intellectual path, how did Vienna itself become this crucible for the ideas that would shape him? What was so special about Vienna then?
Vienna, at the turn of the century, fin de siècle Vienna. It was truly extraordinary. The sources describe Viennese modernism then as being characterized by this incredibly intense collaboration among leading figures from wildly diverse fields. You had scientists, psychologists, writers, artists, all interacting. The Viennese Medical School, the Austrian Economic School, the Vienna Circle of Philosophy, the Musical School, the Young Vienna Literary Movement, they were all working in close proximity, not just geographically close, but as the source puts it, spiritually and communicatively. It was this amazing cross-pollination of ideas, really quite
A
rare.
real melting pot of thought.
Exactly. And what truly stands out here is how the sources pinpoint the revolution in natural sciences, especially Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published just a few years before Freud's birth in 1859 as the absolute driving force behind this cultural awakening. It was seen as the moving principle, the absolute source for all these interconnected fields. Darwin's theory was shaking the foundations, forcing everyone to look at humanity and nature in a completely new light.
So Darwin's work fundamentally shifted the understanding of life, highlighting the predominant role of instinct, reproduction, and crucially, sexuality. How exactly did this biological insight pave the way for Freud to place sexuality at the very core of human psychology? Was it a direct leap?
It was quite direct, yet profound, for the scientific thinking of the time. Darwin's work provided the scientific basis for seeing instinct, reproduction, and sexuality as dominant forces in animal life, and by extension, human life. This wasn't just biology. It fundamentally fixed sexuality as a key, powerful, and often hidden force in human behavior. For Freud, this was a crucial, pre-established scientific truth he would then elevate to the psychological realm. It meant that what was concealed, what wasn't immediately obvious, held immense importance for understanding health and illness.
Right, the hidden element.
Precisely. And Karl von Rokitansky, a key figure who modernized the Viennese medical school, a great pathologist, he articulated a principle that really resonated. Phenomena are observable manifestations of the hidden. End quote. Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this idea, combined with Darwin's emphasis on sexuality, effectively placed sexuality as the crucial hidden element that medicine needed to uncover for a complete understanding.
That makes perfect sense. So with that foundation, Freud naturally gravitated towards medicine, enrolling at Vienna University. He immersed himself in anatomy, biology, psychology, zoology. His first articles were actually on zoology, interestingly enough. But he eventually found his place in Ernst Wilhelm von Bruch's physiological laboratory. And it was there, in Bruch's lab, that he made a truly crucial connection, right? A fateful meeting with Dr. Josef Breuer.
Yes, exactly. Breuer became a close friend and collaborator, and their partnership, as you mentioned, eventually led to their co-authored work, Studies on Hysteria, in 1895. That text really laid the groundwork for psychoanalytic theory.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing in terms of his career path, was it? There were practical challenges.
No, not at all. After finishing his studies in 1881 and becoming a doctor, Bruch, who valued him highly, actually advised Freud to shift from pure academic research to clinical practice. It was basically a financial necessity. Freud needed to earn a living, especially as he was planning to marry Martha Bernays.
Ah, reality bites.
It does. So he continued training at Vienna's General Hospital and eventually opened a private practice. It didn't make him rich overnight, but it kept him afloat. And ironically, this push out of the lab and into the messy world of human suffering, that's where his greatest discoveries were ultimately made.
But that internal passion for research, for exploring the hidden, it never left him, did it? Sometimes leading to brilliant insights, sometimes to, stranger curiosities. Tell us about the infamous cocaine episode. How does that fit in?
Right, the cocaine episode is quite a story. While assisting at the General Hospital, Freud became quite absorbed in studying the potential positive medical properties of coca, the plant cocaine comes from. Crucially, though, he seemed to overlook its negative ones, like addiction. He wrote an enthusiastic article on coca in 1884, advocating its use for various ailments.
Oh, dear.
Yes. This oversight later brought significant criticism from the medical community, and some critics still point to these early narcotic experiments when trying to discredit psychoanalysis, framing them as evidence of, a certain recklessness.
That sounds like quite a misstep, potentially dangerous even. But were there any unexpected positive outcomes from this controversial period?
Remarkably, yes. Despite his misjudgment about addiction, cocaine did have genuine medical uses, particularly as a local anesthetic. Freud's friends, the ophthalmologist Karl Koller and Leopold Königstein, were influenced by his experiments and started using cocaine in eye surgeries. Koller actually became the discoverer of local anesthesia in 1884, building directly on Freud's initial, albeit flawed, work. So amidst the controversy, actual significant medical advancements stemmed indirectly from Freud's curiosity.
That's a fascinating twist. Okay, so following that, in 1885, Freud gets a scholarship to study with the renowned Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, a huge opportunity. There, he encountered Charcot's work on hysteria, observing its hypnotic manifestations and, crucially, its link to post-traumatic stress. This seems fundamental for psychoanalysis. What exactly did Freud take away from Charcot and the French schools that was so groundbreaking?
Well, the sources highlight that Charcot's school, the Salpêtrière, along with the Nancy School, were really advancing the understanding of hypnotism and, critically, what they called psychic causality. This was the idea that our mental experiences, our conflicts, could directly cause physical symptoms, not just psychological ones, which was revolutionary then because the prevailing medical view was always looking for purely biological or neurological causes.
So the mind could make the body sick.
Exactly. The key takeaway for Freud was this principle, the psychic determination of somatic phenomena. The mind can cause physical symptoms. And equally important was the realization that establishing effective contact with the patient was crucial for treatment. He wasn't just observing symptoms, he was learning the profound importance of the patient's inner world and the therapeutic relationship itself.
And this all culminated, as we mentioned, in Studies on Hysteria, published in 1895, co-authored with Breuer, the foundational text. How revolutionary was their approach, particularly this talking cure?
They gave patients a voice. And you have to ask, how profoundly revolutionary was it back then to simply listen to the patient, to invite them to speak freely about their suffering? The source really emphasizes that by doing this, they overcame the prevailing objective psychology at the time, which often treated the disease, not the person, reducing the patient to, quote, a be-slobbered object.
Wow, harsh words.
But probably accurate for the time. By restoring the patient's word, their speech, Freud and Breuer discovered the key to treatment lay precisely in the patient's personal history, articulated during the session. The cathartic method, or talking cure, actually originated from Breuer's famous case of Anna O. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim.
Ah, yes, Anna O.
But Breuer himself got, well, overwhelmed by Anna O's unexpected transference, a term Freud would later define, meaning the patient unconsciously redirects feelings onto the analyst. Breuer ended the treatment prematurely. Freud, however, with his incredible intuition for discoveries, saw the revolutionary truth in the method. He recognized the profound potential in just letting the patient speak and explore their own narrative, even when it got uncomfortable, like it did for Breuer. 2. The unconscious unveiled. Freud's core discoveries.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Freud's insights into psychic trauma fundamentally shifted everything, moving away from purely physical causes to something far more complex, internal.
That's right. Initially, Freud proposed what he called the seduction theory. This suggested that actual childhood sexual trauma was the root cause of psychic illness, of hysteria. But he abandoned this theory very quickly.
Why was that?
Well, basically, he realized it was implausible. Assuming such a huge number of real sexual assaults among the Viennese bourgeoisie, given how many hysterical patients he and others were seeing, it just stretched credulity too far. So his truly revolutionary conclusion, the bedrock of psychoanalysis really, was that actual seduction wasn't necessary. Infantile sexual fantasies alone could be the source of trauma.
Fantasies being as powerful as reality.
Because, as he shockingly posited, children's fantasies are inherently sexual. The mind's internal world, not just external events, held the key. The psychic reality was paramount.
And you can just imagine sexualizing childhood. That must have been incredibly scandalous. The publication of his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in 1905 shocked respectable society, perhaps even more than sexualizing consciousness itself.
Oh, absolutely. It became one of his most popular and widely read books, maybe because of the uproar it caused. It flew in the face of deeply held Victorian sensibilities.
So how did he go about uncovering these repressed memories and fantasies, if not through hypnosis, which he started moving away from?
He developed free association. He found it was far more effective than hypnosis, which often hindered treatment and didn't work for everyone anyway. The core of this method became the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis. Patients must speak everything that comes to mind without censorship or selection. Just say whatever pops into your head, no matter how trivial, illogical, or embarrassing it seems.
Just let it flow.
Exactly. And Freud quickly realized a crucial trick, or rather an observation. The closer a patient got to censoring themselves, to selecting their thoughts, the closer they were to the core of their illness. This holding back, this struggle to speak, led to the concept of resistance. It indicated proximity to the repressed, traumatic content the mind was desperately trying to keep hidden. Overcoming that resistance became key.
And this path ultimately led him to write The Interpretation of Dreams, published right at the turn of the century, 1900. He considered it his most significant work, didn't he?
He did. It was largely based on his own intensive self-analysis, a period of deep introspection. And he famously called dreams the royal road to the unconscious.
The Royal Road. So how did dreams, for Freud, offer such a direct window into these hidden parts of the mind?
Through dream analysis, Freud showed that dreams, much like free associations, reveal the truth of repressed fantasies. He argued that dreams operate through a specific symbolic language, using key figures or mechanisms to camouflage the repressed content. The first is condensation. It's like metaphor in language. Multiple elements, references, even quotes get gathered into one single, often complex dream image.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The sources mention an example like a dream figure representing guilt might combine aspects of someone who accused the dreamer, a scapegoat figure from their past, and maybe even an abusive grandparent, all bundled into one person. It shows the layers of a traumatic memory.
So the mind is being efficient, but also kind of confusing.
Exactly. The second figure is displacement, which is more like metonymy in linguistics. Traumatic content gets transferred from a whole object to just a part of it, or from a person to a seemingly unrelated thing. The example given is seeing a glove on the pavement and suddenly feeling stomach pain. Later, the dreamer realizes the glove belongs to someone they feel guilty towards, and that memory triggers the pain. The glove, just a small part, carries the intense feeling of the whole repressed situation.
Wow.
The profound insight here is that our unconscious mind isn't just chaos. It communicates in a sophisticated, symbolic language. It's constantly trying to surface hidden truths that shape our waking lives, even if we're unaware. Understanding these mechanisms helps decode that language.
So with this understanding that the mind operates on these different levels, conscious, unconscious, Freud started to map it out. His first topography, from the interpretation of dreams, introduced the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. A preliminary map, right?
That's right, a first attempt at mapping the psychic apparatus.
Can you briefly define those levels for us and how they relate to repression?
Sure. In this initial model, the conscious is simply what we're aware of right now, immediate thoughts, feelings, perceptions. The preconscious holds things not currently in awareness, but easily retrieved. Like remembering what you had for breakfast yesterday. It's accessible. Then there's the unconscious. This is the deepest, most inaccessible level, containing repressed desires, memories, traumas, things kept out of awareness because they're too threatening or painful.
And repression is the mechanism that pushes things down there.
Exactly. When the conscious mind encounters something traumatic or unacceptable, the content gets repressed, forced into the unconscious. But as psychoanalysis revealed, it doesn't just vanish. This repressed content can return, often intruding on conscious life in distorted forms, primarily as symptoms, inexplicable anxieties, physical ailments, repetitive behaviors.
So the analyst's job is to bring it back to consciousness.
Essentially, yes, to help bring this unconscious content into conscious awareness. By recalling and understanding these repressed memories and feelings, the suffering they cause can be alleviated.
You mentioned Freud wasn't entirely satisfied with this first map. What was the issue, particularly with distinguishing the unconscious and preconscious?
Yeah, this raises an important point about the nuances. The distinction between the unconscious and the preconscious in this first topography was complex. Freud himself used a lot of caveats trying to differentiate them. He grappled with where exactly to draw the line. It's partly why the term subconscious, which sometimes gets used interchangeably, was later abandoned in psychoanalysis proper to avoid the ambiguity compared to the deeper, more dynamic unconscious, which was his real focus. It was about refining the map.
And Freud also uncovered, through this deeper exploration, what he called the fundamental ambivalence of the human psyche. How did he realize that we're often slaves to conflicting desires, and how does this lead to conflict and repression?
He realized our psychic life is shot through with contradictions. We can simultaneously love and hate the same person. We desire forbidden things while also fearing the consequences. These opposing drives inevitably lead to internal conflict. And when these conflicts are too painful or unacceptable for the conscious mind, they get repressed, pushed into the unconscious, but still active, still exerting influence, often manifesting as neurotic symptoms. This internal civil war of desires is a core engine of psychological distress.
And the prime example of this ambivalence is the Oedipus complex, right?
Absolutely. One of psychoanalysis's most famous and controversial concepts. At its core, for those less familiar, it refers to the child's unconscious sexual desire for the parent of the opposite sex and feelings of rivalry towards the parent of the same sex. Its essence is this clash, the desire to possess the mother versus the ambivalent feelings, fear, respect, hatred, rivalry towards the father. The individual is sort of ripped apart or crucified, as the source puts it, between these powerful desires. When one drive wins temporarily, the other is forced into the unconscious, but crucially, it promises to return. It keeps exerting influence. This foundational conflict, Freud argued, shaped so much of our later personality and relationships.
Freud clearly never stopped refining his ideas, applying them even to the most mundane bits of everyday life. He really believed the unconscious was always at work.
Exactly. His books, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life from 1901, and Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious from 1905 really illustrate this. He showed how the unconscious constantly works its way into conscious life, but always through some kind of distortion or error. Slips of the tongue, Freudian slips, erroneous actions like forgetting names or misplacing things, even jokes. These phenomena reveal repressed desires but in distorted forms. And what's fascinating here, as you mentioned, is that Jacques Lacan, who we'll get to later, saw huge significance in these early works. He believed they showed the unconscious itself is structured like a language, constantly speaking to us even if we don't understand its grammar.
Freud also significantly developed the concept of libido. He moved beyond just thinking about genital sexuality, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Libido, for Freud, came to encompass any form of pleasure derived from an object. This included early narcissistic stages where the self is the object, and also various forms of what were then termed perversions, like fetishism or zoophilia.
So how did he define this broader concept?
He defined libido as the general affective orientation toward an object. It's the energy underlying all transformations of the sexual drive affecting its object, its aim, like sublimation, redirecting drives, and its source of excitation. This quasi-organic, energetic basis was what Freud was looking for as the foundation for psychic causality. Think of it as the fundamental psychic energy, the fuel driving our psychological life.
And he saw it developing in stages.
Yes, he developed its genetic progression through distinct psychosexual stages.
Oral?
Pleasure via the mouth, anal sadistic, focus on control, expulsion, phallic, genital discovery, edible issues, and finally the genital stage, representing mature sexuality and normal development. Fixations at any stage could shape adult personality.
Another crucial development came from his analysis of the Dora case in 1905, transference. Patients projecting feelings onto the analyst. How did he realize this wasn't a problem, but actually a tool?
It was a monumental realization. Initially, yes, transference could derail treatment. Patients might fall in love with the analyst or become deeply hostile, mirroring past relationships. But Freud recognized this wasn't just a distraction. It was the patient unconsciously reenacting crucial past relationships and emotional conflicts right there in the therapy room.
So the past was playing out in the present.
Exactly. By recognizing these patterns, the analyst could help the patient understand how old dynamics were playing out. The analyst's role became to recognize, interpret, and use this dynamic process in treatment, helping the patient work through unresolved issues in a safe space. It became central to the analytic process.
And then in 1907, with Delusions and Dreams in Jensen's Gradiva, he ventured into applied psychoanalysis, analyzing cultural works.
Yes, that marked the beginning of a significant tradition. Not just for Freud himself, he later analyzed Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, but for countless followers applying psychoanalytic ideas to art, literature, culture. It showed the far-reaching applicability of his theories beyond the consulting room. Okay, so the 1910s saw a major theoretical synthesis, metapsychology. He intended it to be a bigger work, but only 5 essays were published.
That's right. He planned 12, but only 5 survived or were published, including key ones like instincts and their vicissitudes, repression, and the unconscious. The goal was ambitious, to provide a general model of the functioning of the human psyche.
And he used 3 distinct approaches in this model. Can you break those down?
Certainly. The metapsychology used 3 interconnected lenses. First, the topographical approach, mapping the psyche into regions unconscious, preconscious, conscious with censorship as boundaries, like a map of the mind's territories. Second, the economic approach. This focused on the circulation of psychic energy, libido, between these regions, how energy flows and transforms. Erich Fromm later made that interesting comparison between Freud's Homo sexualis and the economist's Homo economicus, both driven by underlying quantifiable forces. Third, the dynamic approach. This views the psyche as an internal war, focusing on the conflicts between drives and defenses. Mental life is a constant struggle. So topographical, economic, dynamic, a multi-layered way to look at the mind's workings.
Exactly. Together, they offered a comprehensive way to describe how the mind works, not just what it contains. It was a powerful synthesis of his ideas up to that point.
But then came the pivotal 20s turn, profoundly marked by Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920 and the Ego and the Id in 1923. What was so radical about this shift? How did it change his view of human drives?
This was truly a radical rethinking. Freud encountered phenomena that just didn't fit his earlier pleasure-unpleasure principle, the idea that we always seek pleasure and avoid pain. He saw patients resistant to getting better, engaging in masochism, having recurring traumatic nightmares that constantly replayed unpleasantness, things that defied the pleasure principle.
So something else had to be driving things.
Precisely. These observations led him to hypothesize a deeper, more fundamental conflict. The opposition between eros, the life drive, self-preservation, love, creation, and a newly proposed death drive, or thanatos. He saw the death drive as a basic biological instinct pushing towards a return to an inorganic state, a state of zero excitation, absolute rest.
The death drive. That sounds quite dark.
It is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the death drive represents a fundamental self-destructive tendency, an innate drive towards dissolution, towards an end to all tension. It introduced a profound philosophical pessimism into his later work. Humans weren't just driven by pleasure, but also by an unconscious pull towards inertia, towards nothingness.
And it was out of this radical shift that the second topography emerged, the id, ego, and superego. These are probably the most famous Freudian concepts. Can you distinguish them for us?
Yes, this model became incredibly influential. The id operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It's the unconscious, anarchic, lawless drives, primal, impulsive, demanding immediate gratification. The ego is the conscious self, the I. It's the organized, realistic part that mediates between the id's demands, the external world's realities, and the superego's prohibitions. It makes decisions, navigates reality. The superego in this model kind of replaces the preconscious. It represents internalized morality, parental and societal standards. But Freud saw it as embodying the force of the death drive, acting as the defense of all defenses, the ultimate cruel law prohibiting pleasure. It's the source of guilt and shame, often relentlessly critical.
So the ego is caught in the middle.
Exactly. This fundamental conflict between the instinctual id and the prohibitive superego, with the conscious ego trying to find balance, became synonymous with psychoanalysis for many. It offered a powerful way to understand internal struggle, guilt, morality.
And Freud applied this new model broadly, didn't he, to society and culture?
He did. In Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, 1921, he looked at how groups identify with leaders. In The Future of an Illusion, 1927, he analyzed religion as a kind of collective neurosis, an infantile defense against helplessness, where the superego imposes prohibitions. And perhaps most famously, in Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, he argued that civilization itself is built on suppressing our instinctual drives, particularly aggression and sexuality. That culture demands we renounce pleasure for the sake of social order, leading to a pervasive discontent.
So, to summarize Freud's final model, psychic life is driven by this fundamental conflict, I versus superego, with the ego mediating. Mental illness is an escape from this conflict, and psychoanalysis aims to liberate us by bringing the conflict into awareness.
That's a very good summary. The goal is to strengthen the ego, to make it more aware of the unconscious forces driving it, allowing for more conscious choice and less suffering from repressed conflicts. Where id was, there ego shall be, as he famously put it. 3. The scientific debate. Psychoanalysis under scrutiny.
Okay, this brings us inevitably to the big question, the one that's always hovered around psychoanalysis. Was it or is it a science? We should remember Freud wanted it to be a science, didn't he? He had that youthful dream of being a great scientist.
He absolutely did. He wrote to his fiancée about wanting to return to Vienna with great enormous fame to cure all incurable nervous patients. The scientific ambition was definitely there from early on.
And some thinkers, like Erich Fromm, seem to cautiously agree.
Yes, Fromm saw Freud as a true scientist in spirit, arguing he adapted methods to study the irrational, things traditional science couldn't easily measure. Fromm even suggested Freud proposed an early form of system theory, viewing the psyche as a complex dynamic system.
But then came the critics, strong criticisms from the scientific community.
Oh, absolutely, and some were quite damning. Edward Shorter, the medical historian, assessed psychoanalysis as basically dead in medicine and having the intellectual status of Esperanto even in humanities departments. Ouch.
Double ouch. But the most famous critique probably comes from Karl Popper, right? The falsifiability problem.
Yes, Popper's critique is legendary. He argued psychoanalysis is pseudoscientific because it fails his falsifiability criterion, meaning there's no conceivable observation that could prove it wrong. Popper famously said he couldn't think of any human behavior that couldn't be explained by either Freud's or Adler's theories. They always fitted, they're always confirmed. And for Popper, this apparent strength was actually its fatal weakness. It had, quote, a ready answer to all questions, making it untestable, therefore unscientific in his view.
So how do psychoanalytic thinkers today grapple with that? It seems like a fundamental challenge.
It is, and responses vary. Some acknowledge the empirical difficulties but argue Popper's criterion, designed for natural sciences, might not be the right yardstick for understanding subjective human meaning and motivation. Psychoanalysis, they argue, offers interpretive frameworks, not predictive laws. Others try to bridge the gap, integrating psychoanalytic concepts with neuroscience or cognitive psychology, looking for empirical validation for specific aspects of the theory, like the existence of unconscious processing or the impact of early relationships. It's an ongoing, complex effort.
However, amidst this debate, some offer a more nuanced view. Eric Kandel, the Nobel laureate in medicine, for example, he acknowledges the lack of traditional proof, but identifies key Freudian ideas that have stood the test of time, even finding support in modern neuroscience.
That's right. Kandel highlights three crucial insights. One, first, the predominantly unconscious nature of psychic life. Modern cognitive science confirms vast amounts of mental processing happen outside awareness. Two, second, the idea of innate, genetically influenced drives, like aggression and sexuality, operating from early life. While the specifics are debated, the concept of core biological drives is fundamental. Three, and third, the understanding that normal and disordered psychic life exist on a continuum. Mental disorders are often extreme forms of normal processes. This shifted psychiatry away from a simple sick-healthy binary.
So Kandel's conclusion is quite positive, despite the scientific criticism.
It is, surprisingly so. He concludes that Freud made an enormous contribution and that psychoanalysis, even a century later, remains the most influential and coherent complex of ideas about mental activity. He acknowledges the empirical limits, but stresses the profound conceptual impact.
Okay, so that leads us to another perspective, one that perhaps sidesteps the whole "is it science" debate. Our sources, Kostov echoing Rutkovich, suggest viewing psychoanalysis as hermeneutics. What does that mean exactly?
It's a really important shift. Viewing psychoanalysis as hermeneutics means seeing it as a practice of interpretation, like literary criticism or biblical studies, rather than a natural science seeking objective laws. In this view, psychoanalysis becomes an archaeology of the subject. It's about excavating layers of meaning within a person's inner world, interpreting the text they present through their speech, dreams, slips of the tongue, symptoms.
So it's about interpreting meaning, not measuring energy.
Oh, precisely. This lens cleanses psychoanalysis of what the source calls its naive positivism, its sometimes awkward attempts to mimic natural science. It positions it instead as a robust humanistic discipline, focused on meaning, narrative, and understanding the complex symbolic life of the individual. It's about understanding what something means in the context of a life story, not just how it works mechanistically.
And this hermeneutic framing, seeing the unconscious as structured like a language, leads us perfectly towards Jacques Lacan, who really ran with that idea, didn't he?
He certainly did. It sets the stage perfectly for understanding his return to Freud through the lens of language. 4. The heretics and dogmatists. Diverging paths.
As psychoanalysis grew, it wasn't just ideas evolving, but the movement itself. The sources often use this analogy of a church or a sect with dogmas, hierarchies, heresies. Why do you think that analogy kept cropping up?
It's a striking analogy, isn't it? I think it captures the intense belief, the almost sacred importance Freud's early followers placed on his ideas. And Freud himself had a certain charisma, attracting fervent disciples. But what's fascinating is the paradoxical dissidence of Freud himself. His later theories, especially the death drive, were significant departures from his early focus on sexuality alone. Bridging his early and late work wasn't entirely smooth.
So Freud himself was kind of a heretic against his earlier self.
In a way, yes. His own intellectual evolution mirrored the heresies that emerged from his followers, as they too grappled with interpreting and expanding his often evolving ideas. It shows how dynamic the whole process was.
So this wasn't a smooth, linear progression. It was full of internal conflicts, dramatic splits, realignments, almost like intellectual revolutions within the field itself.
Absolutely. It was a very human, sometimes very contentious process.
Okay, let's look at some of these heretics. The first official dissident, according to our sources, was Alfred Adler, an Austrian physician, a socialist, who developed individual psychology. What was his main critique of Freud?
Adler's core critique was that Freud's reductionism made him miss the living human personality. He felt Freud's reliance on pre-personal categories like the Oedipus complex meant the analyst always knew what they'd find, turning psychoanalysis into a dogmatic system. Adler believed Freud lost sight of the unique facts of individual cases, overshadowing the person's subjective experience and goals with universal drives.
So Adler focused more on the individual's goals.
Exactly. He saw the individual as a dynamic, becoming being, driven by a personal goal, a striving for superiority, not necessarily dominance, but self-realization. This is teleology, a goal-oriented approach, which contrasted sharply with Freud's focus on past causality. For Adler, you understand someone through the goals they form early on and how they strive for them.
And this led him to his most famous concept, the inferiority complex. How did that emerge from this goal-oriented view?
Well, if you're striving towards a goal, that goal becomes your yardstick. Adler said a traumatic defeat on that path could lead to the failure itself becoming the defining criterion. That's the inferiority complex. The person then measures their whole life by that failure, feeling inadequate. The sources use Freud's life as a counterexample. He wanted to be a great discoverer and became one. Despite setbacks like the cocaine scandal or initial rejection, he didn't let failure become his defining criterion. If he had, he might have developed an inferiority complex himself.
So treatment for Adler was about overcoming that complex.
Yes, revealing the hidden complex to return the person to their original path, fostering courage and independence. His approach to education was similar. Avoid humiliation, build confidence, make sure no child should lose faith in their future. It was a more optimistic, socially minded psychology.
Okay, next dissident. Carl Gustav Jung, probably the most famous Swiss psychologist interested in the occult.
Jung was initially seen as Freud's crown prince, his intended heir. Freud hoped Jung, being Aryan, could help psychoanalysis break out of its perceived Jewish ghetto.
I hope that backfired later, didn't it?
Tragically, yes. Jung's later collaboration with the Nazi regime is a significant stain. But initially, Freud had immense trust in him, which, like with others, quickly soured into a bitter split.
What was their core disagreement?
Jung acknowledged the erotic conflict Freud focused on, but rejected it as the sole pathogenic factor. He found Freud's concept of libido too narrow, defining it instead as a general psychic energy that included Adler's will to power, plus spiritual and creative drives. For Jung, the unconscious was much broader than just repressed sexuality. It encompassed mythology, symbolism, spirituality, drawing from his studies of world religions and alchemy.
So Jung aimed for a synthesis, integrating Freud and Adler.
Yes, he called it a synthetic method. He saw both Freud, causality, and Adler, teleology, as valid but one-sided. He wanted a broader theory that integrated both, seeing the psyche as a self-regulating system needing opposition.
And this led him to his most distinctive contribution, the collective unconscious.
Exactly. This was Jung's major expansion. Unlike the personal unconscious, repressed individual experiences, the collective unconscious is shared by all humanity. It's populated by archetypes, primordial images, and patterns like the hero, the shadow, the great mother, the wise old man. These are universal, inherited patterns found in myths, dreams, art across cultures. It's a transpersonal dimension, moving way beyond the individual ego and personal history into shared human experience. This dive into the collective, often using complex mythology, dramatically broadened the scope of the unconscious.
Our third key dissident, Otto Rank. Talented but lacked medical training and also had a fractured relationship with Freud. What was his radical shift?
Rank's big idea from his 1924 book, The Trauma of Birth, was to shift focus from the Oedipal triangle, father, mother, child, to the pre-Oedipal relationship with the mother. His radical thesis was that birth itself is the primal trauma, a violent separation from the paradise of the womb. This trauma, he argued, is repressed but governs all later life. All subsequent pleasure is an attempt to restore that lost intrauterine bliss.
So the Oedipus complex was secondary for Rank.
Yes, he even reinterpreted the Oedipus myth not as incestuous desire, but as a symbolic attempt to return to the womb. Oedipus blinding himself was like returning to the darkness of the maternal body. This predictably infuriated Freud. He saw Rank as depriving the father figure of significance, challenging his core theories, and perhaps his own patriarchal authority. Ironically, Freud himself later acknowledged pre-Oedipal attachment, but the damage with Rank was done.
And Rank applied this birth trauma idea broadly, too.
He did. He saw religion as a quest for return to the womb, and even suggested different paths to health. For women, becoming a mother. For men, healthy genital sexual contacts as a substitute return. It was a very different focus from Freud's emphasis on the father and the law.
Amidst all these heresies, there were also the dogmatists in Freud's inner circle, like Ernest Jones and Carl Abraham. What was their role?
They were the staunch defenders of the Freudian orthodoxy, the guardians of the letter of his theory. They criticized opponents, handled the real politics of the psychoanalytic movement, tried to maintain cohesion.
But this had a darker side, too.
Yes, the The sources mention Jones's troubling readiness to deal with the Nazis, alongside Jung's collaboration. And ironically, the effort to establish psychoanalysis in the Anglo-Saxon world, led partly by Jones, resulted in American ego psychology gaining dominance, a form Freud himself disliked, seeing it as a dilution of his core ideas about deep unconscious conflict. So the victory was perhaps a defeat for orthodox Freudianism in the long run. V. Psychoanalysis beyond the couch, philosophical engagements.
Despite, or maybe because of, these internal conflicts and criticisms, psychoanalysis proved incredibly adaptable, expanding into other fields. One fascinating example is Freudo-Marxism, a synthesis of two philosophies of suspicion. What does that mean?
Philosophies of suspicion. A term associated with Paul Ricoeur refers to thinkers like Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who questioned surface appearances and sought to uncover hidden, often uncomfortable truths driving individuals and societies. Both Freud, unmasking the unconscious, and Marx, unmasking ideology and economic structures, shared this spirit of revealing hidden determinants. This made their synthesis compelling for thinkers like Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse, who saw parallels in their projects.
How did Fromm connect them?
Fromm highlighted shared principles: a spirit of doubt, humanism, focus on human evolution, concepts like neurosis, Freud, and alienation. Marx, the importance of independence, recognizing hidden forces. He argued for a unified humanistic theory aiming for both individual psychological liberation and social economic liberation. For Fromm, the two were inseparable.
And Herbert Marcuse, his Eros and Civilization was hugely influential.
Yes. Marcuse explicitly applied psychoanalytic concepts to critique society. He introduced the idea of surplus repression. He argued that society imposes more repression than is strictly necessary for survival and basic order. This excessive repression, Marcuse claimed, serves only productivity and power structures, controlling not just work but even leisure time through mass media, preventing people from realizing possibilities for greater freedom and pleasure.
So this surplus repression was actually harming society.
Marcuse thought so. He believed that if libido were freed, even partially, from these unnecessary constraints, it would naturally demand even greater freedom, potentially leading to radical social change. He saw the potential for a fundamentally different, less repressive way of living.
This led to his libidinal revolutionary program, eliminating surplus repression via the Great Refusal, using creative imagination, liberating libido from tedious work and conservative norms. What would that liberated society look like for Marcuse?
He envisioned a non-repressive civilization where work could become more like play, where art and sensuality weren't confined but permeated daily life, where relationships were based on genuine affection, not competition. It was a utopian vision of freeing Eros from the chains of excessive societal control, leading to a richer, more fulfilling existence, hugely influential for the 60s counterculture.
Now, let's shift to René Girard, a French thinker who offered a very different synthesis, blending psychoanalysis and anthropology.
Girard's core idea, from violence in the sacred, revolves around the deep ambivalence of violence in the sacred, particularly in sacrifice. He argued that unresolved violence constantly threatens to tear societies apart. The sacrificial victim, then, acts as a substitute. Killing the victim allows the community to drain off its internal conflicts and restore harmony, at least temporarily. But this creates an endless cycle of sacrificial rituals because the underlying violence is never truly eliminated, just redirected. The sacred itself is often born from this primordial violence.
And he engaged critically with Freud's totem and taboo.
He did. He credited Freud with the profound insight that a real killing, the primal parasite in Freud's myth, might lie at the origin of myth and religion. But Girard argued Freud misidentified what was repressed as a result of that killing.
Okay, so if Freud thought desire, like the incestuous desire in Oedipus, was repressed, what did Girard argue was actually repressed? How does that change our reading of myths like Oedipus?
Girard's central claim was that it's not desire that is repressed in myth, but violence itself. Rereading Oedipus, Girard argued the overwhelming guilt wasn't primarily about incestuous desire, but about Oedipus's monstrous acts of violence, killing his father, marrying his mother, which unleashed the plague of reciprocal violence on Thebes. For Girard, the underlying repressed force threatening society is always collective violence, and sexuality often just provides pretexts or intersects with it. So myths, for Girard, are narratives attempting to conceal or manage an originating act of collective violence, not primarily repressed desire. It's a fundamental rereading.
Then we have an even more radical critique. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, an anti-Freudian manifesto from 1972.
Yes, a hugely influential book, especially for the post-68 generation. They argued psychoanalysis was an idealistic turn, a system of pacifications. They saw the unconscious not as a theater of repressed family drama, Oedipus, but as factories dynamic, productive machines constantly generating desires and connections. For D&G, psychoanalysis enslaved the analysand by forcing these desiring machines into the restrictive narrative of the Oedipus complex. They felt psychoanalysis feared the creative revolutionary nature of delirium, which they saw as a positive liberating force. Psychoanalysis became, in their view, part of the repressive apparatus itself.
So they called for schizoanalysis instead, to free this revolutionary delirium.
Exactly. Schizoanalysis aimed to liberate these unconscious flows, this delirium, seeing it as a source of social dynamics and creativity, something to be embraced, not cured or contained by the Edel framework.
How did René Girard respond to this critique?
Girard, in his essay, The System of Delirium, offered a counter-critique. He argued that by intentionally describing their own arguments as delirious, Deleuze and Guattari made their claims unfalsifiable. You couldn't logically refute them because they just say, well, it's delirium. Girard felt this turned their critique into rhetoric, not reasoned argument. While he agreed Freud struggled to explain delirium, Girard didn't think D&G's delirious explanation was a relevant solution. He felt a more rigorous, logical interpretation was still needed, not an abandonment of reason itself. 6. Setting the stage for the next deep dive, the event of Lacan.
So as we wrap up this part of the journey, it's just incredibly clear, isn't it? The sheer diversity of interpretations, the fierce criticisms. Despite it all, they underscore the profound importance of psychoanalysis in 20th century thought. Freud's ideas had this incredible generative power.
Absolutely. And it's striking that after Freud's death, orthodox Freudianism, in its original form, wasn't often defended. This led to this huge diversification, especially as psychoanalysis found an unexpected but perhaps inevitable ally in linguistics. This turn towards language, as the sources suggest, was a kind of saving gesture for psychoanalytic theory, allowing it to evolve and maintain its relevance in a completely new intellectual landscape.
This brings us to a really fascinating turn in this story. The sources reveal that this saving gesture came, maybe surprisingly to some, from Jacques Lacan. Who was this French Freud? And what clues do we have about his early life that might hint at his future impact?
Yes, Jacques Lacan. Undeniably, the most famous and significant psychoanalyst after Freud. And what's so intriguing is that despite radically reinterpreting Freud, Lacan never declared a break. He always insisted he was returning to the true Freud. There's that famous anecdote Lacan claimed Freud said it about America, though it might have been Lacan's own projection. They don't know what we're bringing them. The plague. It captures Lacan's sense of psychoanalysis as a disruptive force and perhaps his own intellectual ambition.
And his background. Similarities to Freud.
Some interesting echoes. Born into a well-off family in 1901, also a first child like Freud. Described early on as having a capricious and tyrannical nature. His path was unique. Catholic college led him to atheism, then medicine at the Sorbonne. His mentor was Gaëtan Gatien de Clermont, a major psychiatrist known for his work on automatism and delusion. Interesting connections there to language and structure.
And his early professional work already hinted at his provocative style.
It certainly did. He got his diploma in criminology and forensic medicine, then wrote his doctoral thesis on paranoid psychosis and its relation to personality. Later, he'd make the shocking claim that paranoid psychosis is, in general, personality itself, radically blurring pathology and normalcy. It's also notable that Freud's own reaction to Lacan's early thesis was quite lukewarm. Just a polite thank you, no great enthusiasm. Freud perhaps didn't see the revolutionary potential brewing there.
So how did this capricious doctor, whose early work didn't even impress Freud himself, become the next titan of psychoanalysis? How did he reshape it through language and philosophy? Well, that, our dear listener, is a story for our next deep dive. Outro. Wow, we've really covered a lot of ground today. Journeying comprehensively through Sigmund Freud's life, tracing the evolution of his, well, truly groundbreaking theories, and exploring those dramatic splits, the profound reinterpretations by his heretics and philosophical successors. It's been quite a tour.
It has. What we hope we've highlighted is that psychoanalysis, however you classify it scientifically, just profoundly changed our understanding of the human mind. The role of the unconscious, those hidden forces shaping individuals, societies, it redefined the whole landscape of psychological thought.
So what does this all mean for you listening now? Perhaps by understanding this dangerous method, its origins, its complexities, its controversies, you gain a new lens, a new way to view not just yourself maybe, but the subtle hidden currents in the culture all around us, seeing the unseen, understanding the unspoken.
Exactly. And here's a final, maybe provocative thought to leave you with. The sources suggest that reviving interest in Freud's intellectual legacy might, in a way, help revive and uphold the spirit of the Enlightenment itself. Remember Freud's famous line from 1933, no less? Wo es war, soll ich werden. Where he was, there ego shall be. It prompts us to consider, is our continued exploration of these unknowable psychic depths actually an act of enlightenment? A testament to the power of reason to confront the irrational, to try and bring it into the light. Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.